Hello dear students. Today I shall discuss on World Trade Organizations. After reading this chapter, you will be able to understand basics of WTO, origin, objective and operations, resolution of trade disputes, trade policy reviews, assessment and a critique about WTO, and also at the end I will discuss few more issues regarding this. World Trade Organization is an organization established to supervise and liberalize world trade. The WTO is the successor to the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which was created in 1947 in the expectation that it would soon be replaced by a specialized agency of the United Nations to be called the International Trade Organization, or in other words ITO. Although the ITO never materialized, the GATT proved remarkably successful in liberalizing world trade over the next 5 decades. By late 1980s, there were calls for a stronger multilateral organizations to monitor trade and resolve trade disputes. Following the completion of Uruguay round in 1986-94 of multilateral trade negotiations, the WTO began operations on January 1, 1995. The ITO was initially envisaged along with the International Monetary Fund and World Bank as one of the key pillars of the post-World War II reconstruction and economic development. In Havana in 1948, the UN Conference on Trade and Employment concluded a draft charter for the ITO known as the Havana Charter, which would have created extensive rules governing trade, investments, services and business and employment practices. However, the United States failed to ratify the agreement. Meanwhile, an agreement to phase out the use of import quotas and to reduce the tariff on merchandise trade, negotiated by 23 countries in Geneva in 1947, came into force as GATT on 1st January 1948. Although the GATT was expected to be provisional, it was the only major agreement governing international trade until the creation of the WTO. The GATT system evolved over 47 years to become de facto global trade organization that eventually involved approximately 130 countries. Through various negotiating rounds, the GATT was extended or modified by numerous supplementary codes and arrangements, interpretations, waivers, reports by dispute settlement, panels and decisions of its councils. During negotiations ending in 1994, the original GATT and all changes to it introduced prior to the Uruguay round were renamed GATT in 1947. This set of agreement was distinguished from GATT 1994, which comprised the modification and clarification negotiated during the Uruguay round, referred as Understanding plus a dozen other multilateral agreement on merchandise trade. GATT 1994 became an integral part of the agreement that established the WTO. Other core components include the General Agreement on Trade in Service (GATS), which attempt to supervise and liberalize trade. The Agreement on Trade related aspects of intellectual property rights (TRIPS), which sought to be improved protection of intellectual property across borders, the Understanding on Rules and Proceedings governing the settlement of disputes, which established rules for resolving conflict between numbers. The Trade Policy Review Mechanism, which documented national trade policies and assessed their conformity with WTO rules, and 4 plurilateral agreements signed by only a subject of the WTO membership on civil aircraft, government, procurement, dairy products and bovine meat, though the lateral 2 were terminated at the end of 1997 with the creation of related WTO committees. These agreements were signed in Morocco in April 1994, and following their ratification, the contracting parties to the GATT treaty became charter member of the WTO. By 2020, the WTO had more than 160 members. The WTO has 6 key objectives. First is to set and enforce rules for international trade. Second is to provide a forum for negotiating and monitoring further trade liberalization. Third is to resolve trade dispute. Fourth is to increase the transparency of decision-making processes. Fifth is to cooperate with other major international economic institutions involved in global economic management. And sixth is to help developing countries benefit fully from the global trading system. Although shared by the GATT, in practice these goals have been pursued more comprehensively by the WTO. For example, whereas the GATT focused almost exclusively on goods, though much of the agriculture and textile were executed, the WTO encompasses all goods, services and intellectual property, as well as some investment policies. In addition, the permanent WTO Secretariat, which replaced the interim GATT Secretariat, has strengthened and formalized mechanism for reviewing trade policies and settling disputes. Because many more products are covered under the WTO than under the GATT, and because the number of member countries and the extent of their participation has grown steadily, the combined share of international trade of WTO members now exceeds 90% of the global total. Open access to markets has increased substantially. The rules embodied in both the GATT and the WTO serve as at least 3 purposes. First is the attempt to protect the interest of small and weak countries against discriminatory trade practices of large and powerful countries. The WTO's most favored nations and national treatment articles stipulated that each WTO member must grant equal market access to all other members, and both domestic and foreign suppliers must be treated equally. Second, the rules require members to limit trade only through tariff and to provide market access not less favorable than that specified in the schedule. For example, the commitment that they agreed to when they were granted WTO membership or subsequently. Third, the rules are designed to help governments resist lobbying efforts by domestic interest groups seeking special favors. Although some expectations to the rules have been made, their presence and replication in the core WTO agreements were intended to ensure that the worst excess would be avoided. By thus bringing greater certainty and predictability to international markets, it was thought that WTO would enhance economic welfare and reduce political tensions. The GATT provided an avenue for resolving trade disputes, a role that was strengthened substantially under the WTO. Members are committed not to take unilateral actions against each other members. Instead, they are expected to seek resources through the WTO's dispute settlement system and to abide by its rule and findings. The procedures for dispute resolution under the GATT have been automated and greatly streamlined, and the timetable has been tightened. Dispute resolution begins with bilateral consultation through the mediation or good offices of the Director General. If this fails, an independent panel is created to hear the dispute. So, the panel submits a private draft report to the parties for comments, after which it may revise the report before releasing it to the final WTO membership. Unlike the IMF and the World Bank, both of which use weighted voting, each WTO member has only one vote, As in the earlier 𝗏 system, however, most decisions are made by consensus. Unless one or both the parties files a notice of appeal or the WTO members reject the report, it is automatically adopted and legally binding after 60 days. The process is supposed to be completed within 9 months, and if an appeal is lodged, the WTO appellate body hears and rules of any claim of legal error within 60 days. Appellate rulings are automatically adopted unless a consensus exists among members against doing so. The WTO also seeks to increase awareness of the extent and effects of the trade distorting policies, a goal that it accomplishes through annual notification requirement and through a policy review mechanism. Notices of all changes in member trade and trade-related policies must be published and made accessible to their trading partners. For many developing countries and countries whose economies were centrally planned, the requirement was a major step toward more transparent governance. The WTO reviews the trade policies of the world's 4 largest traders. These are the European Union, United States, Japan and China. Once every 2 years, the policies of the 16 next largest traders once every 4 years, and the policies of all other traders once every 6 or more years. After extensive consultation with the member countries under review, the WTO Secretariat publishes its review together with a companion report by the country's government. The process thus monitors the extent to which members are meeting their commitment and provides information on newly opened markets. It also provides a firmer basis for subsequent trade negotiations and the resolution of trade dispute. The pace of international economic integration via the 𝗏 or WTO rounds of multilateral trade negotiations had been slower and less comprehensive than some members would prefer. Some have suggested that there should be additional integration among subgroups of a neighboring members' economies, example those parties of the European Union or the North American Free Trade Agreement, superseded by United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement signed in 2018, and Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation for political, military or other reasons. Notwithstanding the most favored nations clauses in agreement establishes the WTO, the organization does allow such preferential integration under certain conditions. Even though many such integrations agreements arguably do not involve substantially all trade, the WTO main conditions there has been little conflict over the formation of free trade areas and custom unions. The most common omissions from such agreements are politically sensitive sectors such as agriculture. Beginning in the late 1990s, the WTO was target of fierce criticism. Opponents of economic globalization and in particular those opposed to the growing power of the multinational corporation argued that the WTO infringes upon national sovereignty and promotes the interest of the large corporation at expense of smaller local firms struggling to cope up with the import competitions. Environmental and labor groups, especially those from wealthier countries, have claimed that trade liberalization leads to environmental damage and harm the interest of low-skilled unionized workers. Protests by these and other groups at WTO ministerial meetings, such as in 1999 demonstration in Seattle, Washington, US, which involved approximately 50,000 people, became large and more frequent in part because the development of the internet and social media made large-scale organizations and collective actions easier. In response to such criticism, supporters of WTO claimed that regulations trade is not an efficient way to protect the environment and labor rights. Meanwhile, some WTO members, especially developing countries, resisted attempts to adopt rules that would allow for sanctions against countries that fail to meet strict environmental and labor standards, arguing that they would amount to valid protectionism. Despite these criticisms, however, WTO admissions remained attractive for non-members, as evidenced by increase in the number of members after 1995. More significantly, China entered the WTO in 2001 after a year of the accession negotiations. The conditions for Chinese membership were in some ways more restrictive than those for developing countries, reflecting the concern of some WTO members that the admission of such a large and still somewhat planned economic might have an overall negative effect on free trade. So, after understanding the whole structure of WTO, how it functions, how they admission new member countries, there are few issues that in current era one must know. In other words, I can say that we can also discuss on the critique of WTO. Let us discuss. The stated aim of the World Trade Organization is to promote free trade and stimulate economic growth. The actions, methods and fundamentalism of the World Trade Organizations evokes strong antipathies. Among other things, the WTO is accused of widening the sociological gap between rich and poor it claimed to be fixing. Critics contended that small countries in WTO wield little influence, and despite the WTO aim of helping the developing countries, the politicians representing the most influential nations in the WTO and within those countries or between them, influential private business interests focus on the commercial interest and profit-making companies rather than interest of all. Martin Coor argues that the WTO does not manage the global economy impartially, but in its operations has a systematic bias toward rich countries and multinational corporations, harming small countries which have less negotiation power. Some example of this bias I would like to quote here is the first one. The poor countries had expected that the rich countries would open their markets in agricultural and textile sector, but the results have been largely disappointing. Protection in most rich countries remains extremely high through a variety of instruments. The second is in agriculture, the tariff of OECD, you may be knowing OECD countries are heavily biased against low priced farm products produced by developing countries. The third issue is import quotas are more extreme version of the same policy. Rather than just making developing countries' products less competitive, quotas do not allow those products passed to certain volume to compete at all. Other is the quotas on clothing and textile were to be phased out by 2005, but there was lack of progress in this regard. The fourth example is that rich countries pay large subsidies to their domestic producers, which affect the market prices of agriculture goods, causing direct harm to poor countries. European Union subsidized exports have contributed to the decline of dairy industries in Brazil and Jamaica and the sugar industries in South Africa. Annual subsidies in rich countries considerably exceeded the national income of all sub-Sahara Africans. Rich countries jealously protect their own domestic interest in the name of free trade and globalization under the auspices of WTO. Researcher argues that developing countries have not benefited from the WTO agreement of the Uruguay round, and therefore the credibility of WTO trade system could be eroded, according to, as I mentioned earlier also, Coor, one of the major categories of the problem of implementation of Uruguay round is the way the northern countries have not lived up to the spirit of their commitments in implementing their obligations that agreed in various agreements. Even other also believes that the Doha round negotiations have veered from their proclaimed direction oriented or development friendly outcome towards a market access, directions in which developing countries are pressurized to open up their agriculture, industries and service sector. As per Jagdish Bhagwati, he says that there is a greater tariff protection on manufacturer in which poor countries which are also overtaking the rich nations in the number of anti-dumping findings. Other critics claim that the issue of the labor and environment are steadfastly ignored. Who was the former director of the Global Environment and Trade Study, he believes that the WTO should begin to address the link between trade and labor and environmental concern. Further, labor union condemned the labor rights record of developing countries, arguing that to the extent the WTO succeeds at promoting globalization, then in equal measures do the environmental and labor rights suffer. On the other side, there were questions that if environment and labor were to enter the WTO system, it would be conceptually difficult to argue why other social and cultural issues should also not enter. So there are the conflict between the social environmental issues. Bhagwati is also critical toward rich countries' lobbies seeking on imposing their unrelated agendas on trade agreement. According to Bhagwati, these lobbies are especially the rich charities have now turned to agitating about trade issues with much energy understanding. Therefore, most of the Indian geographers, they criticized the introduction of 𝗘𝗍𝗺 into the WTO framework, fearing that such non-trade agendas might overwhelm the organization's functions. One of the geographers says that taken in isolation, 𝗘𝗍𝗺 resulted in reduced welfare for developing countries and the world as a whole. In other words, other issues such as intellectual property right, that also comes in the limelight, and the matter was forced onto WTO agendas during the Uruguay round by the pharmaceutical and software industries, even though this risked turning the WTO into a glorified collection agencies. Some countries push for certain regulatory standards in international bodies and then bringing those regulations home under the requirement of harmonization and the guise of multilateralism. This is often referred to as policy laundering. The question now arises, what needs to be done? Action has to be taken at two levels, international and domestic. At international level, resistance has to be built against the developing countries so that a level playing field is available to goods and services exported by developing countries. The net impact of the protective and discriminatory policies of USA and OECD countries is to corner all benefits of globalization in their favor. But in the long run, low prices dampen incentives to invest, which leads to stagnation of agriculture on which many poor people depend. That leaves the rich country farmers as the sole true beneficiaries of subsidies, with a multitude of losers across the globe. So at the international level, combined pressure of developing countries is bound to make an impact. If two big developing countries such as China and India mobilizes support from Brazil, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Philippines, Africa, etc., it could be represented the voice of 2/3 of people of the world. Developed countries will ultimately have to yield to basically logical stand of these countries so that benefits of globalization should be equally shared between developing and the developed world. At the domestic level, developing countries should improve their agriculture, in agriculture infrastructure, Irrigation is the most important, especially in context of India and also of China. Moreover, agriculture exports need to be boosted up. Agriculture credit must be available at lower rates of interest. Many thinkers and analysts opine that the WTO has benefited only the developed countries. The mechanism of globalization, marketization and liberalization has the potential of becoming an unguided missile which could cause havoc in a good part of the globe. The growing disparity among the countries of the world in almost all indicators is a clear evidence. So in nutshell, I discussed all the positive and the negative points of WTO. Despite several critiques, WTO had proved its importance and at certain extent has led to advanced level of cooperation among the countries or world for better trade relations. And during current time, during COVID-19, as the critiques are emphasizing that countries as also there is a requirement that countries should also become self-dependent and Atmanirbhar, and in that ways they can collaborate with their neighboring countries.